Hello, my name's Charlotte and I work for Imperial War Museums. I'm based in Manchester and we've been working on a project over the past few months that looks at women's experiences of war and peace. So we've been working with lots of different researchers, archives and museums. And I'm really pleased today to welcome Judith from the Devil's Porridge Museum. And she's going to be sharing some stories with us about women in the First World War. So I'll hand over to you, Judith.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to share my screen and show you a bit of information about the Devil's Porridge Museum, which is where I work and where I am sitting right now. We had just opened yesterday. First time in months, so we're delighted to be open to the public again. So yes, I'm Judith Hewitt. I'm the manager of the Devil's Porridge Museum, which now resides in this beautiful state-of-the-art 5-star rated building. Hasn't always been so. The museum started out in the back of a church in Eastriggs in Dumfries and Galloway 25 years ago. It started out with a few laminated displays and it's been volunteer led and volunteer run. It was in the past and it still is today, although now they've got a few hired members of staff such as myself. The museum exists to tell the story of a secret war, an aspect of war that a lot of people don't know very much about. There was a book written a few years ago called Gretna's Secret War, and the museum exists to make sure it's a secret no longer. So we've been sharing that history for 25 years. So in 1915, Britain was close to losing World War I. We now know, of course, that the war was won in 1918 by the Allies, including Britain. But in 1915, people didn't know that. It seemed like Britain was going to lose World War I. And the reason for that was that the army in the trenches was running out of ammunition, specifically shells and bullets. And there was a rumour going round that the soldiers at the front were just being given 3 bullets each a day, that they were being rationed to how many bullets they could have. Without bullets and without shells, the army would be overrun and defeated. So action needed to be taken, and the government took over an area of land 9 miles long and 2 miles wide on the Anglo-Scottish border, bought the whole thing, everything that was on it, and took over the whole area. And there they built a huge munitions factory, the biggest factory in the world at that time. And they called it His Majesty's Factory Gretna, or HM Factory Gretna. And at its height, it employed 30,000 people, 12,000 of them women. So people might think the war was just fought in the trenches, and they might think the war was just fought by men, but it wasn't. It was fought in Scotland, or Anglo-Scotland, and the Anglo-Scotland border, and it was also women played a major role in the war effort. So this is the site of HM Factory Gretna. You can see where I am right now in the museum, just in Eastriggs there. It stretched from Dornoch in Scotland, 9 miles all the way over to Longtown in Cumbria in England, and it was 2 miles wide at its thickest part. And you can also see Eastriggs and Gretna, the townships that were built for the factory. And you can still see now some of the aspects of what's left, so the little bits of the factory that remain. And you might also now be able to hear the rain beating down on us in this lovely part of southwest Scotland, which is really very loud, so I apologise for that. So the question is, what is the Devil's Porridge? Really, everyone will know what gunpowder is, essentially. Gunpowder is an explosive material, an explosive substance. Cordite largely replaced gunpowder. That's a simplification, but essentially cordite is an explosive material. And it went inside every single bullet and every single shell that was used in World War I. And where the name The Devil's Porridge was coined by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He visited to HM Factory Gretna in 1916, and he saw young women in Scotland mixing white, lumpy, bumpy stuff in big pots like these, which we nicknamed porridge pots. And he saw this white, lumpy, bumpy stuff being mixed by women in Scotland, and he thought, porridge. But it's not the sort you want to eat. It's a devilish sort because it contains acids and all sorts of other unpleasant chemicals. And it's the sort that ultimately would blow up in your enemy's face. So it's a destructive thing, not a pleasant thing at all. So just a little bit of background on life at HM Factory Gretna. People came from all over Britain to work in the factory. We know of one munition worker who came from Cornwall, one came from the Isle of Man, lots came from Ireland. We know there were Gaelic speakers working in the factory, so they must have come from the Highlands of Scotland. We know people came from the northeast, so sort of Durham and Newcastle and places like that. And also people came from all over the British Empire. So we know there were Australians, Canadians, one person we know of came over from India. Lots of people came from South Africa because they'd worked in the diamond mines there, working on explosives there. So they came from all over the world to help turn the tide of the war at Gretna. And this picture shows George V, the king at the time, visiting Gretna, and you can see the excitement on the girls' faces. And also, I always think in this picture, just how young they look. They're very young girls. The factory, once it was operational 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the women and the men would be working throughout the night. And at the end of the war, the factory was closed and most of the workers returned to their pre-war lives or work. So some people returned to Australia, some people returned to wherever it was they came from. Some people got married and moved with the people that they met while working at the factory as well, but that's a whole other story. So this picture is one of my favourites that we have in the museum collection. It shows in the background a state-of-the-art factory being built with all these people coming from all around the world with their expertise and all this money being thrown at it. But in the foreground, you can see turnips growing. And I think that kind of sums it up beautifully. It's like they were in such a rush to get going with the factory to help provide the soldiers at the front with the bullets and the shells that they needed to stand a fighting chance against the might of German industry. They were so preoccupied with getting on with that, they didn't even have time to pick the turnips in the fields there. A lot of the labour in H&M Factory Gretna was done by women. And this is a beautiful photograph of a group of female workers. The women were mainly aged 16 to 20, and at the time they called themselves the Gretna Girls. They were mainly working class and mainly single. So although it was difficult work, it was dangerous work, it was unpleasant work, and also they had all the stress of living through the war. They might have brothers, husbands, sons, even, who were fighting at the front, and they had all of that anxiety. A lot of them actually seem to have had quite a merry old time and made friends for life in the midst of war. And some of them found love and married, and some of them had lovely experiences, enjoyable experiences. Others had terrible experiences, but that's the differences between people. So this picture shows you some of the hostels that were built. The young women lived in purpose-built hostels. So like this one here, which is Central Avenue in Gretna. This still stands today. Gretna was completely built in 1916, as was Eastriggs. Gretna Green is an ancient settlement, but Gretna is quite completely new. And each of these hostels, the girls had a little cubicle just to themselves, with not much privacy. They didn't even have a door over their cubicle. They just had a curtain. Because they had a matron who would keep an eye on them and make sure that no gentleman came calling at night and they didn't get up to any hanky-panky. Matron must not have done a very good job because they did have to build a maternity unit. And there are also several records that record illegitimate children having been born while young women were working at Gretna. So despite the curfews, despite the hostels and all the sort of the protections that were in place, some people still managed to get up to things in their own time. There was also a concern that the women might become morally corrupted, so they had a women's police service to keep an eye on the female workers. And these are two members of that organisation. This picture, which also is really beautiful, shows children at the school. They built a school at Gretna and a school at Eastriggs for the factory workers. So during this time of war and difficulty, life still continued. People met and got married. They had children. Children went to school. There were social and recreational clubs. There were cinemas, there were dances, there were lectures, there were other opportunities for training and sports days and fetes and things like that. It was a whole community up here. But the work was difficult and it was dangerous. There were fires, explosions, accidents, ill health, and we also know of people who were killed either by falls from height, being crushed in industrial accidents, or even being having acid burns that led to them dying. So lots of horrible injuries that took place, as well as just chronic ill health as a result of coming into contact with fumes and chemicals, which could cause breathing difficulties, could cause skin discoloration, as well as nausea and headaches. The famous canary girls, that the girls' skin turned yellow because of the contact with the fumes. So moving on to look at some individuals from HM Factory Gretna, and what the focus here is really little individual acts of spirited rebellion that show that people in the past were people just like us, that they got up to things, they had personalities, they had wills of their own, they didn't just do what they were told. They were a little bit naughty or spirited or individualistic. So this is Charlotte Woodhouse. You can see her with the big arrow pointed at her head. She heard about the factory and she wanted to go and work there because she enthusiastically believed in the war effort and she wanted to do her bit with the other girls who were nicknamed Tommy's sister. So Tommy at the front and Tommy's sister back home. So she actually lied about her age to work in the factory. So it just shows you that people were willing to go that extra mile and to break the rules a little bit to achieve what they wanted. So her older sister and herself both worked in the factory, and her brother served at the front and came home wounded. So it really was a family effort in World War I for the Woodhouses. This is Lily Florence Curl. She, another young woman who desperately wanted to work at HM Factory Gretna, but her father said no, she should stay home and look after her mother full time. And Lily, we heard this from her daughter. Lily said she was happy to look after her mother a bit, but she didn't need full-time care, even though she was in a wheelchair. So Lily decided to apply for a job in spite of her father's naysaying. And every day she cycled 7 miles to work at Gretna, worked an 8-hour shift and cycled 7 miles home. And for the first few months, she did this secretly. So her father didn't even know where she was working. She told him she got another job somewhere else. She did this 3 years during the war in all weathers and all seasons. So she was completely committed to what she wanted to do. She had her own mind and she was an independent person, like lots of young women are. This is Grace Hodgson. We don't actually have a photograph of Margaret Hodgson, unfortunately, but Margaret Hodgson sounds like she was a bit of a character. She worked at the Atlas Works in Carlisle, which is a large factory. Carlisle is only about 5 miles, maybe 10 miles away from where I am right now in Eastrix. She worked at the Atlas Works in Carlisle, making shirts for the army. While she was there, she led a protest to her employer on behalf of the female workers, demanding more pay. And this was largely because she said people were getting paid more working at HM Factory Gretna. So why, if the girls could get paid more there, why couldn't they get paid more at the factory where she worked? So the owner caved in, granted her request, paid the female workers more. But Margaret eventually decided to leave anyway to work at HM Factory Gretna with her sister Grace. And they worked at Gretna for a couple of years, making munitions. So there's a few individual stories. It's hard to know what the young women thought about HM Factory Gretna. We've got these wonderful objects in the museum collection called autograph books. And I just thought I'd share a couple where you get a little bit of an idea of what the women really thought about their life. And this is probably one of my favorites. And it says, God made the bees made the honey. The Gretna girls have done the work and the chemists have got the money. And this was written by someone called A. Pearl, who came from Sunderland. And I think that idea that the young women were doing all the labour and all the hard work, but that other people, the male workers, were getting all the rewards, financial rewards, is certainly something that resonates today and has continued to. Women are consistently paid less for the same work, or they find themselves in lower paid work because of systemic injustices and lack of education, training, and also often a lack of confidence on the part of women, which you may have experienced yourself. This is another one that gives a slightly different view of the war from an autograph book. People wrote signatures and little bits of sentimentality. My grandma kept one of those. I remember it very well. She used to whip it out and read out little things that she remembered, little phrases or sayings for different seasons of the year or different events or different thoughts and things like that. So this one says, if only those who caused this war were the only ones to fight, a better world would this have been for the aching hearts tonight. And I'm sure that's something we can all sympathise with, you know, when you think of your own children. You know, it seems like often in the past wars were fought by other people's sons and other people's children. You send the leaders sending them off to fight, and the ordinary people doing the crying and the mourning and suffering the loss. And this again is a slightly more cynical view. So when war is on and danger nigh, God and the soldier is all the cry. When war is over and all things righted, God is forgotten and the soldiers slighted. Which again, I'm sure we can all relate to that. The treatment of armed forces in the past has been pretty horrendous, and their well-being hasn't been considered very much at all. So this one might make you chuckle. Women, they have many faults. Men have only two. Everything they say and everything they do. That one certainly makes me laugh. And it makes me think of lots of people that I know, male and female. Yeah, that just thought that might give you a laugh too. So it's nice to know that people in the past, even in the midst of war, had a sense of humour, and that relations between men and women haven't really changed much for thousands of years, I'm sure. So just having a look at some of the other things that happen in the factory. Women's football. This is from a document in the museum collection which talks about the idea of whether or not girls should play football. So it says here there has been some division of opinion as to the wisdom of encouraging them to pursue this branch of sport. They have not been prohibited from doing so, so it's not forbidden. And some pitches have been available, but however, they've not officially been sanctioned. So there were a lot of young women who played football in World War One, and in Gretna they had their own team, and this is a colorized version of the team. They were called the Mossband Swifts, and they played football. And this is a photograph of them with their mascot, one of the gorgeous little child in the middle there. And they played football across the north of England and the southwest of Scotland in a league, but it wasn't an official football league. So I thought that's quite an interesting example of young women not being said you can't do it, just saying please we'd rather you didn't do it, but they did it anyway, and they set up their own team. And by the looks of them, particularly the girls on the front, they look like they had a good time, and some of them look like they really mean business. And we think that one of these young women, the captain, actually later played in Wembley as well. She's on a Pathé film footage that we've recently discovered of a sort of 1921 final between two women's football teams. So she obviously had quite a good career in women's football. So here's a little bit of a naughty situation, a young woman doing something she definitely shouldn't have and breaking the law. This is one of two cases of bigamy we know connected with HM Factory Gretna. And this young woman, Jane Doherty, or Butler, who was 28, she had two children in Belfast. She had a husband and two children in Belfast, and she abandoned them during the war, came to Glasgow, and then came to HM Factory Gretna. And when she came to Gretna to work as a munitions girl, she conveniently forgot that she was married with two children, and she married a police officer and then was arrested for being a bigamist and having two husbands at the same time. She was sentenced to a month in prison, and the last we know of her from the records is that the police officer, her second bigamist husband, was still visiting her in prison. So perhaps it worked out in the end. Maybe it was true love. So here's an example for you as well of self-expression. So something we've looked for in the factory accounts is, were any of the girls members of trade unions? Were any of them suffragettes? Did any of them protest or rebel, or were they conscientious objectors or part of any of these massive movements at the time? The answer is we don't know really. There's no evidence of that. But this is a beautiful example to me of young women wanting something and achieving it. So this is from the local paper on November the 11th, 1918. It's reporting events that took place in the factory when the war ended. So it says here, the girls were rather anxious as to the form of the evening's proceedings. The idea of a concert was scorned, and there was unanimous support for a dance. It was, however, found that there were difficulties in the way, and the supervisors, the factory bosses, did not see how these could be overcome. The girls, however, would not take a refusal, and they besieged one of the officials of the township, was taking a great interest in amusements as exceedingly popular. Some diplomacy had to be used, but the girls had their way, and a dance was arranged, and it proved to be a most successful and enjoyable event for 400 people. So to me, that's just a wonderful example of a very, very small, slight protest where the factory official said, let's have a concert, let's have something quite staid to commemorate the end of the war. And the girls said, no, we've worked, we've slaved, we've suffered, we've done so much sacrifice. We want a dance, we want a party, we will have one. And I love this idea of them besieging the officials of the township to get a dance. And they achieved it. They got the dance, and it sounds like they had a wonderful time. And after all that work and all that suffering, I'm sure they deserved it. So just to finish, this is something that we put together for International Women's Day with the Imperial War Museum Subject Specialist Network. This is a beautiful picture of a lovely, lovely young woman called Nellie Watson. And Nellie and her best friend travelled down to work at HM Factory Gretna from Fife. And we put this together for International Women's Day. And the lady who gave us this image and shared this image with us also gave us a book of Nellie's poetry. She went on to become a well-known poet. And the lady who gave it to us is Nellie's great niece. And when I showed her this and sent this to her, she said it brought a tear to her eye. She was so proud that her great aunt was being commemorated on International Women's Day in 2021. So I thought that was a nice fitting way to end it, that the Devil's Porridge Museum and everything we're doing is about making sure that these people, these women, aren't forgotten, and sharing their stories with people such as yourselves. So thank you very much for listening. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Judith, for such an interesting presentation. We really appreciate you putting that together for us, and we hope that those of you watching will enjoy it as well.